Hello! We're going to talk about watercolor paint today and just give you the basic rundown on how to use this specific type of paint, which is called a pan. These little watercolors, each of these are in its own individual pan, right? We have 3, 6, 7, 8 different colors, and it comes with its own little brush. All right, so first things you'll need is this, right? The brush, the paint. You can remove this cardboard from that. And then if you have your sketchbook, please get that out. That will work fine. If you don't have a sketchbook, or your sketchbook is totally full, that's okay. You could also use just regular copy paper. However, this paper is a little bit thicker and will hold the paint better. Ideally, if you really like watercolor and you want to get better at it, there's something called watercolor paper, which has these little ridges in it and is really perfect for watercolor painting. You could get that at a store like Michael's or order it online. The brush that it comes with is really small. It's not the best brush in the world. However, it'll work, especially for small areas. If you want to paint a bigger area, I recommend looking into bigger brushes. You can get round brushes like this, or even a flat one would do really well for big areas that you want to paint. Okay, you can also find other small brushes. I personally prefer the round ones just because they have a little bit more control. However, sometimes I do like using a flat one, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So a flat brush, this one's tapered, which is at an angle, but if you find a flat brush, it's really nice also for doing a big, smooth wash, and I'll show you what that means. All right. Also, another tip, you're going to need some sort of water, all right? It's in the name, watercolor. Watercolors need water to activate the little pigments in the paint. So I just use an old jar. If you have a cup at home you can use, or if you eat yogurt or any sort of thing that comes in a little container, just wash it out after you're done and you can use that as your watercolor cup. All right, so just fill it up with a little bit of water. You don't need a whole lot. And let's get started. So if you just want to start by experimenting, you don't really need to draw anything out. However, if you want to, you can always start with sketching something in a pencil, right? With a pencil. So if I just draw a simple flower, something like that. So then I know what I want to paint. And let's see. So there's a couple techniques that I want to show you first. And just to let you know too, watercolor paint is transparent, meaning it's like see-through, and it tends to leave brush strokes. So it can be challenging to control. So just remember to be patient, patient with yourself, patient with the water, and all of that. It flows, water will always flow from a wet area to a less wet area. So if I wet my paper right here, for example, let's see what happens. And I just want to start with purple. So I'm just going to wet my brush and put it directly in the pan. And you want to build it up, so you might need to add a couple water drops in there. And you just do that by dipping your brush in the cup and then putting it in the pan. Then, as you see, I had already wet this part of the paper, so I'm just putting the wet paint on the wet paper. And you can see how it just starts moving on its own. I am pushing it now, and as the paper gets drier, the paint tends to flow to that dry area. And your brush can help smooth it out and control it. You can try holding your brush in different ways. I like holding it closer to the edge for more control. And if I have bigger areas, I tend to move my hand back a little bit. All right, so this is also called a wet on wet, which is a technique where you have the paper wet first and then you put wet paint on top of it. It's really good for areas that you want to look like flowy or washed, right? Kind of like what I'm creating here in this background. If you come to a point where it dries, like I just did right here, I just wet my brush. I didn't put paint on it, and I just kind of spread it out. So you can try that. But you can already see that the paint's drying and you'll get these edges. So be aware that wherever your strokes end up on the paper, they can leave traces of the paint. Okay, so let's experiment. We have that wet on wet. So if I want to put paint just directly on the paper without wetting the paper first, what happens? So this is called wet on dry. I'm going to do it with the yellow. And the more water you have in your paint, the lighter it will be. The less water you have on your paint, the darker it will be, the closer it will be to this original color. So if I want it really bright and bold, I don't need too much water, and it's best if I just go wet on dry. So now you see that bright yellow circle. Okay, so that's a great technique, especially for small detailed areas, and you want precise shapes. All right, so a thing about mixing colors, I highly recommend do not mix in the pans themselves, okay? Because that would cross-contaminate it, right? If I put red in here, it'll turn it orange. And then if I need yellow again later, it just messes it up. So don't ever mix within the actual pure pans. So try to keep these pure and nice and neat. There's a few things you could try. If you want, you can use your lid. I just remind you to like dry it off before you close it after you're done, so you don't get paint mixing in there. But you can use your lid if you don't have anything else. You could also use like a lid for from like a yogurt container or any other plastic lid you might have, like a takeout container. Or if you want to invest in this, it's only like about 99 cents at Michael's. It's called a palette, and it comes with these little holes that are really great for mixing watercolor paint. And I recommend getting one of these if you really enjoy this and get serious about it. But most of you probably just have your lid, so I'm going to show you how I would mix a color. So let's say I want my flower to be, maybe like, I'm trying to think, maybe like an orange. So I would take the yellow first, right? I wet it. And the hard part about mixing colors is sometimes you don't mix enough and then you run out when you're painting your area, and then you have to try to mix the same color. So just be cautious of that. Now I'm going to take some of the red and mix it in. All right, so I just had this little water pool, and the reason why this palette would be easier, it contains the paint a little bit more because they're little holes. So when you're just doing it on your tray, it might look a little loose and wild, but it's okay. So if you want to test it first on your paper, let's just see if I like this color. You can just do a little swatch like that. I think it's okay, but I kind of want to make it a little bit more yellowy. So I'm going to take some more yellow. I put water on my brush first. Take some, mix it in. All right, I think that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and just do the wet on dry technique and paint in my flower here. And I'm just pushing the paint to spread it around. Kind of like when you're using color pencils or crayons, trying to stay in the lines. Just do the best you can. And I have to refill my brush ever so often, so I'm seeing it, right, it's getting lighter. So I just go dip back in my little mix that I made and then just add more to it. Maybe a little bit more. There you go. All right, so with watercolor too, it's best if you do lighter layers on the bottom. So I recommend if you ever do multiple layers, build it up by doing lighter layers first, let it completely dry, right? This is still pretty wet. And then if you want to add darker details, darker colors, wait for this to dry and then add more on top later. But that is the basic 101 tips on watercolors. I forgot to mention too, I do have a paper towel. You can use a regular towel too, but it's really helpful when you're mixing colors to tap your brush on the towel first so you don't mix, don't cross-contaminate the colors. So I'll just show you one more time for mixing. I put some purple there and say I want to make a blue-violet. I rinsed my brush, made sure there wasn't any color on it. Then I just added some to this. And let's see what it looks like. Ooh, that's nice. All right, so that's blue-violet. And you can have some fun, like just experiment, see what you can make with colors. You can look up, there's lots of resources online as well to talk about like watercolor techniques. There's so many out there, but wet on wet and wet on dry are the basic ones that I want you to try. And then remember, when you clean up, it is water-based, so it's pretty safe. Just rinse your brush really well under the sink. You can wipe it off, and then make sure to rinse your water cup, throw it down the sink. If you have a paper towel, you can just wipe your tray so you have a nice clean lid to put onto your palette. And that's a good practice to keep your art supplies nice and safe and neat. All right, that was my basic watercolor video. I hope it was helpful. You can always email me if you have questions.